changes that you
So much in my life with that stuff. Just
if you right click on the bit on the image here, then spotlight for everyone.
That's stop lane notes and traffic.
Thank you, Alex.
Right. Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. Apologies, we've got Steve Hassel, unfortunately, and Bill Ingle aren't making it down. And there aren't any others to give apologies, we're all here.
Stuart's here, isn't he?
He is.
As usual.
No late items. No, all good. Declarations of interest. None, presuming. Minutes of the meeting. So that might be somebody
Yeah,
who was here.
I was here.
Yeah. Anything rising from the minutes? Any
No, not that I've read earlier on now.
The minutes are okay?
Yep.
Right, standards committee forward plan.
I'll take that one, Chair. Thank you, councillors. So this is the, as the name suggests, the Standards Committee Forward Plan for the forthcoming municipal year. It's a standard item for those councillors who are joining us for the first time. It's a standard item that we present to the committee that just allows the Standards Committee to plan out its activity over the forthcoming year. Items can be put forward for consideration to the chair at any time in between meetings, or also added by resolution of the committee. As you'll note from the report, there are several requested items for future meetings that are to be scheduled. So part of the terms of reference of this committee is to review relevant codes and protocols that are related to the Councillors' Code of Conduct. We have one of those on the agenda this evening, which is the Working Together protocol. But there's also the protocol on the use of facilities, services and equipment by councillors, and the guidance on councillor safety, lone working and online communications, which I think this committee reviewed around 6 months ago. The other item that is scheduled to come back to this committee in due course is the government's response to the recent public consultation on changes to the National Standards Framework. The government have yet to respond to that consultation, but when they do, we'll bring a report back to the committee. And also as a result of the recommendations that came out of the recent hearings panel, there's a requirement to review the effectiveness of the changes that were introduced to the Code of Conduct and complaints procedures by full council in November of last year. The hearings panel recommended that the effectiveness of those changes was reviewed after a period of 12 months. So in a few months' time, look to bring that back as well. Aside from that, I'd invite the committee to discuss any other items that you'd wish to see added to future agendas, and of those things that are identified for future consideration, please give a steer on anything you'd like to see prepared ready for the next committee.
Anything? Any comments?
Just a quick comment. I mean, I was sort of on the committee when I was chair. Actually, insisted that we keep this open for any additions or subtraction, and I think that's a good idea, and we should carry on with it.
And if there's anything we think of before the next meeting, obviously just get in touch and we'll try and work that out too. Good. Okay, good. So item 6, review of the Working Together protocol.
Thank you, Chair. That will be me again. As I just mentioned, this is one of those protocols that sits alongside the Councillors' Code of Conduct and is intended to support in the interpretation of the Code of Conduct when it comes to standards matters. As I said, this committee holds delegated responsibility to advise the council on the adoption and revision of these codes and protocols, and the Working Together protocol is one of those. It sits within Part 7 of the council's constitution and is an important governance tool that helps to guide and define effective relationships between councillors and officers. This routine review of the protocol is brought forward to the Standard Committee in order to reflect on the protocol's current content and relevance, consider whether any amendments or enhancements to the protocol are necessary in light of recent experience, and develop any changes that might be considered necessary for onward referral to the full council in due course. As I mentioned, whilst the Code of Conduct is the document against which formal complaints are assessed, the Working Together Protocol plays an important role in informally managing conduct issues within the council that sometimes fall below the threshold for formal complaints, or sometimes in the case of formal complaints, providing a frame of reference for dealing with concepts like treating others with respect, for example, which can be quite nebulous. It's also widely referred to in training and development, helping both councillors and officers to understand their future roles, the different accountabilities, and what reasonable expectations of one another might be in their day-to-day interactions as part of the operation of the local authority. The protocol is intended to provide clear and structured guidance, including shared principles that emphasise concepts like mutual respect, political neutrality and professional integrity, provisions that support due confidentiality, fairness and appropriate behaviour in interactions between both councillors and officers. As I said, emphasising different roles and accountabilities. It makes that important distinction of councillors as public representatives, as policymakers, scrutineers and executive leaders, and officers as impartial advisors who are responsible for operational and technical matters based on their professional expertise. In addition to that, protocol also provides guidance relating to officer attendance at political group meetings and briefings, where there are some quite strict rules around certain processes in relation to overview and scrutiny as well. The circumstances in which attendance at participation in, if a councillor happened to be a resident in Derby, the circumstances in which they would be allowed to participate in certain constitutional processes, for example, attending a neighbourhood forum as a local resident. It also importantly sets out expectations around responses to casework that councillors might raise with the council. So it sets out the 5 working day target that officers work to when trying to resolve casework on behalf of members. And the protocol, I think, has practical implications in lots of different circumstances. So it's routinely used by group whips, for example, and either Emily as the monitoring officer or any of the deputy monitoring officers in managing minor conduct issues that might not result in a formal complaint. It's also used by the Democratic Services team quite widely when inducting new councillors at the start of a term of office, but also more routinely advising colleagues around the organisation about how to go about interacting with councillors and how to meet those expectations that are set of us as employees of the council. It's also used as a key basis for the Code of Conduct training that's delivered annually by Emily, and setting out those standards that are expected of both cohorts. The protocol was last reviewed by the Standards Committee in January 2023. We're not proposing any immediate changes to the protocol, but both councillors and IPs are asked to reflect on any recent experiences through the standards process to identify any gaps in the protocol that may require clarification or work. Important, I think, to note that the hearings panel subcommittee that met in May emphasised the importance of informal interventions as a means of resolving complaints that exist between elected members. And when it comes to informal interventions, it's normally the councillor officer protocol that we're referring to when dealing with those kind of issues as that frame of reference for dealing with what could sometimes be quite complicated or difficult conversations. And obviously, any amendments to the protocol should be with the intention that it remains an effective tool for promoting constructive and respectful working relationships across the council. And I think certainly from my perspective, I would say that the vast majority of interactions that take place between members and officers do meet those expectations. Occasionally there are those that don't, and that's why this protocol exists, to help sort of address those issues. So happy to take questions, to hear feedback from councillors.
Anybody first time they've read it, anything that stands out, anything that's...
I mean, it's relatively comprehensive.
It's out. I think it's a document. It's nice and easy to read, and it does cover an awful lot. I do have some issues that I don't think we can necessarily solve here, and it's not really with the document, but it's over the performance that I experience as a counsellor. So, and I don't know that we can solve that with the document. It's probably actually a resourcing issue more than anything else. But for instance, in 20, it says that casework will be acknowledged within 2 working days, resolved within 5. I find that as a nice aspiration, but something that I rarely get achieved, which I'm guessing is mostly a resourcing issue. But obviously, it's nice to see it written there in black and white, and I don't like to pile pressure on officers, but it's one thing that for me, those targets rarely get hit, and I don't think that's a fault of the document. I don't know if your experience is the same, or what you experience.
I've not experienced it, so I
no right, okay.
Comment.
Yeah,
linked in with the same subject, and it might be a topic for later on to dealing with this casework. I know there's counsellors sending casework through to officers, not through member services. There's no way of knowing if you're asking officers to actually break council policy, because those staff have actually got their own working. And it does sort of get broke at times. I think at some point some advice to stop something happening in the future does need to be given to counsellors.
Right.
And it links into the
I don't know what you obviously talk about something specific.
I can respond to those comments, Chair, if you wish. Sure.
Yeah, carry on.
I think that's fair comment, and I think that evidently across the organisation there are different pressures that exist at different times in terms of responding to councillor casework. What I would say is that if, as councillors, either yourselves or your colleagues are persistently encountering issues with particular services or particular departments, then please contact the councillor support team. We can then remind the relevant colleagues of what the expectation is that's set out within this document and the processes that are in place to support with resolving casework within the organisation. We would encourage councillors to come through either directly to the councillor support team, who will provide casework support, and for those councillors who have got on well with it, use the councillor portal, which is the online casework management tool. One of the advantages of the councillor portal is that it does have these timescales baked into it. So if a case has not been acknowledged within 2 days, it sends a reminder to the officer who's been assigned the case equally after 5 days. So I think, I would say if you are encountering those issues, please come forward and we will look to intervene and try and understand what's causing those delays, particularly if there's a theme or a pattern developing in terms of the types of issues which aren't being resolved to your satisfaction. I think in terms similar in response to your comment, Councillor Hudson, I think that if casework is raised through those channels, it tends to be dealt with in the right way. Where we encounter issues is sometimes, if an individual officer might provide a really, really good service, they sort of, members might quite naturally go to them directly to resolve an issue because they've sorted something else out for them before. There's not always a guarantee that they're the right person to be dealing with that issue. And so we'd always say, come to councillor support first. We can then direct to the most relevant head of service, and then that head of service can then filter that down to their teams who deal with the issues on the ground. And finally, as mentioned in the full plan item, one of the other protocols that this committee is responsible for overseeing is the protocol on use of facility services and equipment by councillors. That includes access to casework support services and support through the neighbourhoods team, and trying to put some governance around the appropriate use of those resources. So maybe that's something we can revisit when that report comes back to the committee in later this year.
Yep, very quickly. I mean, first of all, on what Alex just said, look, sometimes as councillors, we know that if there's an inquiry, we send it direct to a direct service director or a manager, and they reply to us. So people then tend to, if a similar problem arises, they tend to email them and say, look, this is it, which I don't personally think there's anything wrong with it, because if you're contacting councillor support, they then contact the officer. It's just, an extra.
Sometimes people move
in a way, so there is no harm in somebody contacting the officer direct if they know That is, I mean, obviously, if they don't know and they keep contacting other, officers saying, do you know this, do you know that? That's a waste of time. But in terms of if a councillor knows that the particular issue or, casework that they're dealing with can be answered by a officer or a director, I don't see anything wrong with that. Secondly, on the point of the sort of 2-day, 5-day thing, I think it's probably better that next time when we have induction or training event for councillors to say, well, that when you're dealing with casework, they should say to them, well, look, it could take a bit longer, rather than telling a sort of resident that it'll be sorted within 5 days. They then start sort of, shouting at the councillor, who then sort of goes to council support and says, give me the answer. So I think it's appropriate. I mean, I've always told anybody that contacts me that, look, as soon as I get a reply, I'll tell you, I never give them a time frame, because that puts you under pressure. And if you can't deliver during that time, then it's the old adage of, oh, they don't do anything, just come around for the votes. Right. So, but, it works like that. And there is absolutely no harm in telling a resident the truth, which is that it may take 7 to 10 days instead of 2 to 5. And that puts the council in good light, it puts the councillor in good light, and it gives ample time for the officers to respond.
I think Roger Sembley wants to come in, so I'll just be very brief. But I think an important part of the training that we offer to our colleagues, but also to councillors, is to manage. It's exactly that: is to manage expectations. And we would say, don't set expectations. If we were speaking to other officers, don't set expectations that you can't meet. Be honest with councillors about how long it might realistically take to resolve a situation, so you can equally manage that situation with your residents. And we're conscious that you are under pressure to get these matters resolved, so that's not lost on us as an officer.
Sorry, yes.
I was just going to make 2 quick reflections. Firstly, from a personal perspective, as a monitoring officer, I find this document incredibly useful. It's a really helpful gateway for most officers to understand the council, how it works, what their role is as an officer. And so I think I recommend it to officers. It's about 7 pages long. It's a very easy document to navigate through, but it contains a lot of really useful information. Just listening to the discussion, I do wonder if something that we might want to consider is drawing a distinction between casework, which for me, I suppose my definition of casework is when you as councillors receive a communication which says the swings are broken in my local park. Please, can someone look at getting them fixed? That kind of thing I would consider to be casework. But then we also get queries as officers, which are, I would say, more kind of depth, interest areas, things where you as a councillor may want to understand a service area in more detail, or the work of that service area, and that's slightly different to casework. And I wonder if there might be something in this just drawing a distinction between different types of requests and how they're dealt with and the timing around that.
It is worded as standard casework requirements. So I think most of us understand that if we put something more complicated or without the same time frame on, that's not an issue. I do often suffer with just not getting a response back on standard casework. Yeah, well, not even acknowledgement. Nothing happens for way too long with that, and I get really frustrated with that.
And that's not what should happen.
And it's not what should happen. And I understand the pressure that some people in the council are under. And so I very often won't chase it too hard because I know exactly what they're doing. But it's
Just for comment, it might be worth also circulating this to Derby Homes. If you represent an area which has got a high proportion of council, so Derby Homes properties, you're going to get a lot of Derby Homes casework. I do in Chat North, even though it's not as much about as there once was. Those Derby Homes staff do not know this side of it at all, because they're not employees of the council. They're not getting the same information as the employees of the council direct. That's just comment what I've.
There is a slightly different route for casework that relates to Derby Homes. So they have their own. They have a dedicated inbox for Derby councillor casework, and I think it would be useful for us to circulate information to council. We'll liaise with our colleagues at Derby Homes, but remind members of how those issues that specifically relate to Derby Homes tenants and properties can be addressed, because it is slightly outside of this procedure. But equally, the principles contained within this document are just as applicable to employees of Derby Homes as they are to employees of the council. It's just some of the specific rules, I suppose, wouldn't necessarily apply to Derby Homes.
Just very quickly, Jane, in terms of Derby Homes, or if somebody rings up their main office or number, and they are then transferred to the relevant side of it. I mean, there's so many different issues around people living in Derby Homes that it could be a minor repair, it could be major repair, it could be anything. So there are various offices allocated for specific things, but you know, there's never anything wrong with sort of giving a bit more information to people to make it easier for everybody.
No, I mean, if that's useful, worth doing.
I think. Sorry, Chair.
No, carry on.
I think the key here is that inevitably, from time to time, officers might not necessarily live up to the expectations of councillors, and it's entirely legitimate for elected members to raise their concerns about that, or to remind colleagues that there is this target in place. One of the purposes of this document is to make sure that when there is that tension between roles, accountabilities, timescales, that those concerns are raised in a respectful way. And as I said, by and large they are. And when on the rare occasion that they're not, this document provides a really useful framework for having those quite challenging conversations with either officers who may have misunderstood the role of elected members, or equally elected members who might have misunderstood the work that officers are doing.
One other thing here, I don't want to open another can of worms. I'm actually just going to say, really, I still learn way too much information out of the Derby Telegraph, which disappoints me. Well, it's true, and as councillors, we probably all experience that from time to time. And say 42 here, where it says every effort we made to ensure councillors do not hear important information about the council from other sources first. That to me is also a point where we are missing and falling short. And I would like more regular email updates, press briefings, whatever's going out before it hits the Telegraph. I'm either missing something, and maybe I am, but I'm not getting, you know, the information before it hits the papers. That's just a comment from me.
There is a weekly, you know, news. Sort
Yeah, there's a weekly news. Yeah,
sent out, and it something else as well. But
often it's in the Telegraph rather than my inbox, before it's in my inbox, and I find that frustrating as a councillor.
Even when there's no news, the Telegraph prints.
I know that sometimes they just make stuff up seemingly, or it's not, you know. I mean, I'm sure that's not true, but you know what I mean. Sometimes they work hard on making stories. Yeah, and yeah, you could do. It's just for me personally, but that's nothing to do with today. I think the protocol works fine. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
that's my only frustrations with that. Anything else on the item 6 there?
nope.
No. Good. Right. The councillor complaints form. Yeah, well, because we're slightly light tonight, I suggest we can talk about it, but we'll probably bring it back next time just for Steve Hassel and other people to have a look at before we actually.
You can defer it if you wish.
It's entirely up to you, Chair. What was proposing? Sorry, Councillor Khan.
Chair, I don't see the point in three of us looking at it, and then, you know, Steve and Phil come back and have a look at it as well. So I might as well discuss it when they're here.
We'd end up having the same conversation again.
Yeah.
It's just there's no guarantee that they're going to turn up.
Well, if they don't turn up,
I mean, they're normally fairly consistent.
Chair, if I may, the purpose of this report is it was one of the actions that came out of the recent hearings panel to look at the form. What I was proposing to do was to share my screen and run through the process of submitting a complaint. From our perspective as officers, and I won't speak on Stephen's behalf as the person who interacts with the process most frequently, but the online form works quite well from our perspective as officers, and I don't think there's any great urgency with dealing with this item of business, but obviously up to the members of the committee and independent persons whether they want to take it now or at a later time.
Unless anyone's got anything desperate they want to talk about today, we'll defer it.
It probably makes sense if two people aren't here next time, two different people at some point.
Yeah.
We've got to look at it.
Yes.
Yeah, it just need some tweaking. But it's just with just the three of us, we are a bit light, aren't we? All right. Okay. Item 8. So now, is that you again,
Me.
Emily this time.
Emily? Oh,
So, thank you, Chair. This is the discussion of the volume and outcome of councillor complaints that we hold in the public part of the meeting. The headline details of the complaints received in 23-24 and 24-25 municipal year attached to Appendix 3 and 4, and there were 2 live complaints at the time of writing. Since the last meeting, 1 outstanding complaint from the 23-24 municipal year has been resolved by a decision of the hearings panel subcommittee, and that outcome was reported to full council in July, just gone, and recommendations of the hearing panel were endorsed, and obviously reviewing the complaints procedure form is part of that process. Complaints 0424 and 0524 have been resolved since the last meeting of Standards Committee, and there's an opportunity to consider the detail of those outcomes at item 10 of the agenda. There is 1 outstanding complaint from 24-25, and that complaint was awaiting action by the subject member, which is now completed. That means that subject to me undertaking some consultation with the complainant prior to resolution of the complaint, we would envisage that complaint to be able to be closed relatively quickly. We have received 1 complaint so far in municipal year 25-26. And this is currently at the initial screening stage and has been referred to the Independent Person Advisory Panel for their views. And I would leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
good. So, anything else to say on that? No? No? Good. All right. Exclusion of the press and public. So to consider a resolution to exclude the press and public during consideration of the following items on the section. On repair of the Local Government Act, the press will be excluded from the meeting during discussion of the following items on the grounds that they involve the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraphs 1 and 2, part 1 of Schedule 12 of the Act. Public interest in maintaining exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. Good.
You read that fairly quickly.
Yeah, well, I think we hear it too quite regularly. But probably didn't need to read it out.